Hello, friends. I'm going to go ahead and take this off as I do when we do these. Again, all the students who are here, who are a good group of students, say hey. They were trying to make it sound like nobody was here. That's a jerk move. But no, we do actually have a few people here to review with me today. So we are looking at Latin America. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about geography and what the heck Latin America is. You can kind of figure it out a little bit by the title, but if you substitute sort of the word Latin for Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking, that's primarily what we're talking about. Yo!
Is today the 13th?
Today is the 13th, yes, because we have our test 1 week away. All right, yeah, it's okay. Plenty of time. So Latin America, again, is the idea, so usually that means places that are Latin-speaking or Latin-like language-speaking, so like Spanish should be the best option there. It's debatable on whether like Haiti would be in there. I do have it here. We'll talk about it a bit today, but it is a little bit debatable as to whether that's there or not. Some people have different opinions. But basically, if you see the term Latin America on the test, it's going to mean anything south of the Rio Grande of America, right? So Mexico south is going to be Latin America. Now, if it says something like South America, make sure you understand that does not mean Mexico, okay? That's super important for you to remember. If it says North America, though, you could say things about America or Mexico or Canada, right? Any of those would be acceptable. But just because of the cultural connections between the different groups in places south of the Rio Grande River, they have often been connected together. Don't forget, though, there are lots of little spaces down there that are not in any way connected to this, right? So like Belize is a English colony, right? Jamaica was an English colony. These places are places that are not connected to a lot of this other stuff. So just make sure you understand that it's not universal, right? Much like we have in Africa, where there's lots of different kind of concepts. The same thing is also true there. So what we're going to look at here is we're looking at two kind of geographic areas: Mexico, which I will also include Central America, though. I mean, there's not a whole lot going on here that's not in one of these other places. And then also South America over there as slightly separate. You'll notice, though, one big thing here when we look at our dates, right, 1200 down to the present, you'll notice that this 1400 to 1750 tract is basically the same. That's unusual. Most of our other ones we had, this was not the case, right? We definitely had pretty clear divisions, even if there were some connections between them. There were pretty clear divisions between them. But in the case of Mexico, South America, the Spanish colonization and control of Latin America is the whole thing. I mean, this is like everywhere. It's going to be very similar to each other. Again, it's going to be different in some places. So like we'll talk about the Mita system and the Encomienda system, which were different depending on what part of the world you're in. But by and large, a lot of this stuff is very similar to each other. Okay, so that's just a nice little overview for it. Now, one thing that we should talk about, though, first off, is just how different this initial period is. In fact, we could probably even do like kind of a little wiggly line here just to make it look even more nightmarish. But that'll indicate that it is a huge division between these sections, right? So that division then is based around the arrival of Christopher Columbus and the unification of these two different places, of the Americas as well as the Afro-Eurasia. So those are our big fancy terms, right? The Americas and Afro-Eurasia. You will also sometimes hear them called Old World, New World. Again, the former is preferred. Old World, New World is kind of but if you write that on the test, they'll get what you're saying. It's just you're probably going to see Afro-Eurasia or the Americas on the actual test. So just make sure you understand what that is. But prior to this connection, then we are going to have two fascinating civilizations. Okay, so let's start over here in Mexico. We're going to do this a little differently. We're going to do Mexico and then Central America in the early period. We'll talk about colonization, and then we'll talk about these individually from down there, okay? So talking about Mexico and Central America then, in 1200 to 1450, we are going to see the very end of the Mayans. In fact, so much so that we didn't really talk about them this year. I'm not sure if Coach Morgan did, but they're like right at the end of this period. So like like they've sort of ceased to be a factor like literally around 1200 or so. So, but the importance of them, though, is that they are going to have a lot of importance to the Aztecs and some of their cultural things. So, for example, the Mesoamerican ball game, the polytheistic religion and stuff like that, some of the writing and stuff that the Mayans have, these things are going to kind of bring themselves over to the Aztecs as well. So, for example, just a couple things about the Mayans, just in case. Mayans are largely going to organize themselves into city-states with kings. That is their political structure and system. They also are pretty scientifically advanced for the time. They have the concept of zero, which will take quite a while for the Western world to figure out. And they also have astronomy, so they can determine the positions of the stars. They are going to primarily geographically be in the Yucatan Peninsula. That's a part of it's part of Mexico. If you've ever heard like Cancun and places like that, that's kind of where that location is. And they are also going to be polytheistic as well. So they have a similar religion to the Aztecs in a lot of ways, though they're also quite distinct from each other. They do have some form of sacrifice, though it's nowhere near the level of the Aztecs. They are going to have polytheistic gods just like the Aztecs have and stuff like that. Okay, any questions on the Mayans? So that bleeds over into our Aztecs. Now, again, these two are not necessarily related to each other. Like the Aztecs are from like the Nahuatl people, the Mayans are from a different people. Their languages are different from each other, but they do have some inspirations to each other over time. The Aztecs are just fascinating to me. I know we covered them a little bit, but not a ton. But I find them just really intensely interesting. And I think part of that has to do with, in both of these cases, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas, is that the Afro-Eurasian world had some connections, even if they were minimal. So like, if you go from China to Europe, like there's tons of variation and diversity, but there's some basic kind of similarities in some ways, right? But I feel like when it comes to the Americas, this is a whole new world that is developed in a whole new way that is unique and distinct from the rest of the world. But there are still some similarities. So first off, Aztecs, again, their major city is Tenochtitlan. This is a gigantic city that is in the lake Texcoco. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I can spell it out for you. Tenoch Titlan. Nobody is going to, they're not going to take points away from you on the test if you can't spell Aztec words. It's okay. Just get as close as you can. I cannot imagine they will ask you an Aztec question. Like 1200 to 1450 is just not a place they're really going to do a whole lot. This is why I tell you not to worry too much about those first two units. But Tenochtitlan is the capital. They are a tribute state, which means that they are going to conquer local areas, but they will not like politically control them. Instead, they will tell them to give them tribute. That's the way that they keep them under their thumb. They're like, give us food, or give us like products or textiles or slaves for sacrifices and things like that. That is how they're going to keep their thumb on the other local peoples around there. They have a sacrifice-based religion, and of course, yes, that does mean human sacrifice, but it also means sacrifice in general. Sacrifice could be anything from, bleeding a little, or to like smashing your plates and things like that. To break your items or your goods, right? Just to sort of make some sort of sacrifice. They are well known for this like absolute level of sacrifice that they do, of human sacrifice. Again, some of that may be overblown either by the Aztecs themselves or by the Spanish who come later, but they definitely are going to be like, if we have a list of sacrifice people in the Americas, they're going to be the tippy top up there. Okay. They also develop pyramids, so that's going to be a similarity with places like Egypt. Their economy is primarily governed by agriculture, and that is going to be helped by these things called chinampas. So chinampas, again, they're called floating islands. Really what they are is they just build up a lot of like material on the bottom of the lake, and they can grow things there inside of them. So that's a useful way for them to grow extra food, and they're very productive. Also, their economy is mainly done by these traders called poctecas. Primarily, you made kind of your own stuff in general, but the few kind of things that they valued for trade, like bird feathers, or like shiny rocks and things, or like little bits of gold or silver or whatever. Those kind of luxury items are the things that they're primarily going to trade. And the people that did that were called poctecas, and they are literal walking dudes. Like they walk from place to place. They don't have any horses or anything. They have this big backpack, and they go from place to place to try to trade all this stuff. In general, women will have a slightly higher social status than a lot of places around the world at this time. That's primarily because the Aztecs really valued childbirth and felt it was like almost like a type of warfare, like a spiritual warfare. So they valued women for that reason. But again, it's not hugely high. They're still a very patriarchal society. Lastly, they definitely had a social pyramid as well. They had like the emperor and the family, and then they also had like the levels down from there all the way down to slaves. So you're going to have sort of your like aristocratic kind of groups and others. They had different names, but very similar. One thing they had that was unusual was these things called calpulis. They are sort of like big, like almost like clan groups that lived in this area. But they're kind of hard to explain. But anyway, calpuli are sort of these like small clan kind of organizations that were within their government as well. And as we will find out in just a second, they are destroyed by the Spanish. That is where they are going to meet their end. Who's got a question here for the Aztecs? Anything else you want me to fill in? I could see this maybe as like an SAQ on the Americas before Columbia, like tell me something about that. I could see it as like multiple choice question with like a passage or something from like a Spanish person later on talking about the Aztecs and maybe some questions there. It just doesn't seem highly likely they're ever going to do a DBQ on this, and I don't necessarily see that being likely, but that's something that could come up. Okay, now moving down south here to South America, then we are going to have the Inca. So the Inca are actually pretty different in a lot of ways from the Aztecs, primarily as a result of their political structures. So the Inca are going to have centralized control of their government, of their economy. Okay, so they are not these tribute state people, right? The Aztecs are content to sit in their city and like oppress people through tribute state. The Incas have direct and central control. The leader of the Incan Empire is called the Inca. Literally that's the name. They would not have called it the Incan Empire. They have a name for it that it is like unpronounceable to an English speaker. It's this huge word. Tiwatsinsinyu or something. Anyway, doesn't matter. But one of the ways that they will control all this then is through this idea called Incan socialism. So this is the idea where the government essentially owns everything and allows people to control those things. So like in theory, again, not in practice, but in theory in the Incan Empire, the Inca, the emperor, owned literally everything. Like if you were working a farm and you went to sleep in your house, that stuff was all owned by the Inca, and he just basically let you use it. Okay, so part of that then is that they will have this sort of labor system called the Mita system, or it has, I've heard other people pronounce it different names, but this is a compulsory labor system. That is their taxation. So if you, during the year, they'll ask for some people to do labor for them, and then you will labor for the central government. One good example of something you might do was to form the Incan roads. The Carpanan being the most important one. It's a big, long road up and down the Andes Mountains. This empire was very long, so roads were incredibly important to keep it centralized and together, so they would have a lot of these long road systems. Much like the Aztecs, though, they were polytheistic. They did have a bit of an emphasis on the sun. So like the Aztecs had like a god, a hummingbird war god, Huitzilopochtli, who was sort of their like central figure, but he's not like a central figure as much even as like the sun god would be here. Also, the Aztec leader, the Tlaloc, was also not he was like sort of like spiritual and like had some connections to religion, but he was not like the son of God or anything. Like the Inca literally is God, like basically is the God on earth that's there. They also practiced a mummification rituals. They would mummify their old leaders, and that led to veneration of these former leaders. Okay, so basically you would mummify them, you put them in a cave up in the middle of nowhere, and then you would use your money to support the mummy and support their whole system there. At the very end of this period, right before the Spanish come, there's a civil war that takes place in the Incan Empire. Atahualpa will fight against his brother Huascar. Atahualpa will eventually win this conflict, but when the Spanish show up with Pizarro, they will be heavily weakened. Okay, and so that is why when the Spanish show up, they are able to be defeated because of the weakness that they were showing from this civil war that it caused them some problems. Okay.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
I have balloons today. Well, I had balloons today until everyone started popping them all day long. There you go. You don't have to do it now because we already heard one, right? Emma.
What was that civil war started over?
Yeah, I mean, it was just basically a question. So traditionally in Inca society, they would have one of the sons was supposed to take care of the imperial cult, and the other one was supposed to kind of advance and expand. I think in this case they had a disagreement over who was supposed to do those kind of things or something like that. I don't 100% know. I don't know that the Spanish necessarily know either, because again, it's basically concluded by the time the Spanish show up. So we know of it, but we don't know maybe all the details at times. I'm sure there are obviously Incan historians that know a lot more about it, but yeah.
And then, if we get an SAQ about state building, the Inca, as you were talking about Maya system and stuff, the Aztec was like the religion, how they state vote, tribute system.
Her question about the state system. So if you're talking about state system, you're talking about the politics, right? So like in the state system, if the question was about the state system of the Aztecs, you would want to talk about the tribute state, the way that they had a tribute state and that they had a centralized government through the Tenochtitlan, but it wasn't very centralized. Whereas with the Incans, they are going to have centralized control, like literal command control. Like they're like the Soviet Union in 1200, basically, is how that's supposed to work. Okay, cool. All right. So needless to say, we have a huge event here that will massively change the history of the Americas, which is Spanish colonization and control. And of course, that guy, you know him. You probably don't love him too much, but who's that guy that comes over in 1492? Come on, this is a call and response. Who is it? Oh, y'all are the worst. All right, they're the worst. I hope you said it at home.
At least 1 year.
Where's the ocean? No, we're not playing. What's her name? Who's the Spanish? Dora, yeah, Dora the Explorer. Where's the Incas? Yeah, we're not doing that here. Anyway, so huge impact here of Christopher Columbus. 1492, he will sail for the Spanish. He is, again, Italian. He's not actually Spanish himself. He will arrive in his initial thing. He will appear somewhere, probably either the Bahamas, maybe Dominican Republic. I don't really know. They end up having a wreck, and so they leave some of their people behind, but they do take some slaves and others. After that, then they will return. I think he returns 3 more times, and eventually in his lifetime he is imprisoned because the king and queen think he is doing a really bad job and being pretty cruel to the people who are there. Okay, so that's his little story. But regardless of what happens to him as an individual, historically then, the big thing that's going to happen here is all the stuff that's going on with Spanish colonization. So let's look at a couple of different things, but one of the big things we're going to look at here is the Columbian Exchange. So some of the reasons why the Spanish are coming: wealth, rivalry, and religion. So wealth, they're looking for gold particularly. They don't find a lot of gold, but they do find a lot of silver. And so they start sending a lot of silver back from there. Also, they have a rivalry. They are competing against places like England and France and other European powers, so they want to go find new places that they can gain and possess new areas there. We are also going to have religion. So they're looking for converts to Christianity. One of the things they want to do is convert all of the Native Americans to Christianity, and they will try to do so as best they can. Okay, we will also, after Columbus comes then, we will have a number of explorers and conquistadors. So for example, I already mentioned Pizarro, who will show up and conquer the Incan Empire. But additionally, we will have Cortez, who's the guy that comes over and conquers the Aztecs as well. And we'll have a bunch of others, like America, for example. Hernando de Soto is going to make his way through Alabama, for example. So De Soto Caverns is named after him. There's a whole bunch of these different folks who are going to come through. And these conquistadors are primarily like second, third, fourth sons. Like they're the guys who don't have a lot of like advancement for options for their lives. They're looking for new places to conquer and potentially take over. Okay, a couple of things that they will do labor-wise once they get here then. We're going to talk about labor with them. I'll tell you what, this is kind of out of order, sorry, but we'll talk about this system here, and we'll talk about the castas, and then we'll come back and talk about the Columbian Exchange. So once the Spanish are here then, they will set up a system that is designed to extract resources initially. So they will set up the encomienda system, which is kind of like a serfdom for Native Americans. They force Native Americans to work on these encomiendas to get crops and stuff like that. And then in South America, they will use the Mita system. They will use something very similar to that when it comes to the Incas. Now, this system does not last very long because what will replace these labor systems? Slavery, okay? So once these labor systems become kind of unwieldy, once Native Americans have ended up being killed off by a lot of different diseases and things, or once they're able to escape in some ways, they will start to replace these labor systems with slavery instead. This whole area then in general will be New Spain, but that is particularly a name that's associated with Mexico, but you will also see all the other places in that as well. One of the things that gets set up socially or culturally is going to be the idea of the castas system. So the castas is a racial hierarchy in Latin America, right? The casta system is primarily in South America, really, though we do see a little bit of it in Mexico. But like usually when I hear it talked about, like in like Gran Colombia or like Venezuela or something. Though I know it probably did exist in some form in Mexico. So for example, like Mexico, they have like the Peninsulares and the Creole issue as well. Okay, so the primary thing here then we're looking at the casta system is there will be a very, very top hierarchy of people called Peninsulares. These are people of European descent. In other words, they do not have any Indian or African American or African descent, but they are born on the peninsula of Spain. So that's why they are the Iberian Peninsula. That's why they're called Peninsulares. Additionally, then we will have the Creoles or Criollos. These are folks who are also of European descent. If they have any non-European descent, it's like way on back. Like these folks are Europeans, right? But they happen to be born in the New World. Okay, so that is why they are going to be a little bit lower on the hierarchy of the Peninsulares. And this causes essentially all of this that we're going to look at. Okay, all of these Creole revolutions and stuff, that is basically caused by this casta system. Next up then, we will have, it's sometimes called castas because of the name, like we kind of get it from that. But these are basically people of mixed heritage, mixed race, so it could be people who are European and Indian or people who are African and European. It could sometimes apply to like people who are African and Indian, though that's a little more iffy. But they're going to be in that spot. And then lastly, we would have the slaves and the Native American groups that are here. Okay, they're going to be on the very bottom of that hierarchy. So like the Peninsulares are going to be like your royal governors, right? Your Creoles are going to be like the next in command, the people who are running the day-to-day. They're your governors or your mayors and stuff, right? The castas are going to be the people who are doing your everyday kind of work, right? The people who are, I don't know, administrators on farms, stuff like that. And then the slaves and the Indians are the ones who are doing all the real work. Okay, questions just about that? One thing to remember in all these things is that there is always resistance. Okay, there's going to be resistance to these kind of like forces that they have. So one example would be the Maroon Wars in Jamaica, but we also have other examples too. In North America, we have a few more, but the 1690 Pueblo Revolt is a good example of a resistance against the Spanish authorities as well. So there's always going to be this resistance that's going on. All right. So all that said, that's all the kind of like political stuff and everything else. Let's take a look at this big crazy thing called the Columbian Exchange. I love talking about the Columbian Exchange. I think it's super interesting. The whole idea that like maybe we would not have had like certain animals and stuff at certain parts. Like I just can't imagine how strange it would be not to have like cows and horses and things. Like you just have other animals potentially filling those same roles, or maybe not. But it's pretty fascinating. So these two areas were, of course, isolated for thousands of years. And so there are different crops and things that have grown up in those areas. So the Columbian Exchange, again, on its most basic, is the exchange of food, disease, people, and animals between Afro-Eurasia and the Americas. And there's a ton of different examples. These are just a few. So for foods, for example, like we have corn in the Americas, and they have wheat in Afro-Eurasia, and they will exchange those basically. Wheat comes to the Americas, and corn goes to Afro-Eurasia. What's another example of another type of another food that makes its way across, one way or the other? Potatoes go from the New World to the Old. Yeah, what else? There's like literally tons of these. Anybody? What? Tomatoes, also from the New World to the Old. Yeah, good. What else? Anybody else? Maybe you have a couple answers out there as well. Okay, cool. That was good. Right, sure. We named two that both have O's on the end of it. All right, no problem. Next up, disease then, okay? The only real disease we know that comes from the New World to the Old is syphilis, and again, that's debatable. But tons of diseases come the other way. So smallpox in particular is a pretty brutal one. Measles, other things like that, and it will end up devastating native populations. We'll talk more about that over here in just a second. Also, people, okay? Some natives will go to the Old World, but also lots of Europeans, obviously, and Africans will come to the Americas. And then lastly, animals. I always think it's funny when I teach this or anybody teaches this, they always say like a bunch of like American animals went to the Old World, but I don't really know that that's necessarily true. Like I don't think a whole lot of llamas started coming over to Europe in like 1700. I just don't think that happened. I heard, I think Jaimo the other day had a video where he talked about guinea pigs coming to Afro-Eurasia, and I'm like, I mean, but did they? Did they really? I mean, sure, some maybe did that, but not a ton, okay? The reason for that, again, is that most of the American domesticated animals are kind of duds, really. Like, I'm not trying to be mean to alpacas, okay? Don't get me wrong, their fur is beautiful. But they're not, like, you can just grow sheep, and they do basically the same thing, so that's one of the downsides to it. But on the other hand, though, lots of animals are going to come this way. Horses, cows, sheep, goats, all kinds of good stuff, okay? So that is another exchange as well. Now, what is the impact of the Columbian Exchange? Let's take a look at a couple of those. For the Old World, right, economics is going to be a big factor. All that new silver that's coming over as a part of the trade, that is going to crash the economy in a lot of ways. So the inflation is going to go up drastically because they just have tons and tons of this stuff coming over. So that's going to have a big factor, but it also brings a lot more wealth to the Old World. New foods will lead to an increase in population. So in the Old World, we'll see actually more people and people who are kind of generally healthier because they're going to have lots more variety and diversity in foods. We talked about this with potatoes a lot, right? Like potatoes grow almost anywhere. They grow in places where people maybe could not grow food otherwise in Afro-Eurasia, and so that will increase populations a lot. China increases populations a lot from the potato. I think yams, or maybe it's cassava I'm thinking of. Something, one of the African staples also comes over from this as well. Now, in New World, not so good, but there are a few things that are good, I guess. One of the really bad things, of course, is death from disease. We estimate 50 to 90% of the population of the New World is killed off by European diseases. or at the very least, like 50 to 90% is killed. Like it could obviously have been from just conflict or wars or whatever, but we know it's a ton of people die from these diseases. We have lots of historical evidence, and we have lots of analysis that we can make to determine that. So really bad situation there. Also, of course, slavery will come to the New World. Not that it wasn't here before, there were slaves, obviously, but this idea of chattel slavery will come through. Cultural synthesis, though, is kind of a positive thing here in a sense. So Africans who are coming over, Indians who are here, Europeans and others, they will synthesize some of their religion, some of their culture, music, all that kind of stuff will come together and will form a lot of new sort of ideas of culture in this continents. Also, of course, new countries. So they'll have new political structures such as Mexico or Latin America and places like that. Okay. I'm kind of underselling slavery here a little bit, obviously, because we're talking about a lot of different stuff. But I do want to emphasize to you that slavery is hugely important to the history of the Americas. Like, it's the most important. Like, obviously, it has a lot of impact on Africa because they're bringing people over. But, you know, there's still tons of impacts here as well. Like, it's a really pervasive system. It's around for a long time. 12 million people make their way across. Obviously, the Middle Passage is absolutely horrible. I don't want to undercut that a bit, but, you know, that's the situation, and it has a lot of effect on the Americas. Questions? Yeah?
Why are like affiliation diseases so much more deadlier than like any of the American?
Yeah, sure. So we used to read a book in this class called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and he has this posit kind of about this whole issue. And most scientists and historians kind of agree with this generally, which is simply this, that a lot of our diseases, especially ones that are pretty deadly, are transmitted to us from animals, right? So any population that has a close contact with animals is potentially going to have that come to them. So if you think about smallpox, it's likely it evolved from another type of pox, like cowpox or something like that was less deadly and came into to human beings. We can see this with the coronavirus now. I don't know if they've ever 100% determined where it came from, but we're pretty sure it made its way through some sort of animal. You know, like I've heard everything from bats to pangolins, those like weird like spiky armored things. I don't know, whatever. But regardless, like when you have a close connection between human beings and animals, some of those diseases can potentially jump, and that can be some of the worst types of diseases. So guess what they don't have a lot of in the Americas, right? They don't have a lot of animals. And they particularly don't live closely with animals. And most of in the Americas, there's a bit more of an emphasis on a little bit. It's kind of reductionist to say this, but they're kind of a bit better about like bathing and stuff. So all those things mean that there's just not as much disease like this in the Americas, and so they have zero protection to it. It's part of the reason why COVID this year has been so devastating initially. Like if you look at the numbers initially, the people who got it had a lot worse outcomes, partly due to like hospital issues and stuff, but also just there was like zero connection with our immune systems with that. I imagine that in the long run, like as people, as this goes along or whatever, even without vaccines and stuff, it will probably become less and less virulent over time. Like I imagine it won't be particularly deadly in the future, even if we didn't do a whole lot. That's just kind of how diseases work in general. But I don't know. Could also mutate and go crazy. And I'm not going to say what I was going to say because it's depressing. But you get the point, okay? You get the point. All right. Any other questions here on that time period? All right, let's make the big shift over. This is one that a lot of people had a lot of questions about. I did my best here for this, but again, it's hard to fit some of this into this kind of little spot here. And the whole point of this is to give a nice big overview of some of this stuff, so we can go over a little bit more of this in class if we need to. But the next phase then that we have here after 1750 is going to be a bunch of these revolutions, particularly these Creole revolutions that are going to be in Latin America. You could also kind of call like the Mexican War of Independence similar things, as well as the Haitian Revolution, etc. So before we get into the specifics of some of these, again, the basic idea here of this is that there is Enlightenment ideals that are coming out in this period, in the 1750s or so. Voltaire is writing in the 1740s. A lot of these Creoles in the New World are reading all this stuff about individualism and freedom and Enlightenment. And they're like, yeah, man, we love this stuff. Why do we got to listen to these, fuddy-duddy old peninsulares and stuff? And so they want to have some form of independence. Now, much like Catherine the Great in Russia, who's not really interested in all parts of Enlightenment, they are also not particularly interested in getting rid of slavery and stuff. But still, they want a lot of these Enlightenment concepts, these Enlightenment ideals. So that is a big factor for why they want to start doing these revolutions. Additionally, Napoleon's going to mess everything up, basically. When Napoleon comes in after the French Revolution, he is going to cause a lot of problems. He will basically replace the throne of Spain with the King of Spain with his brother, and that causes a lot of people who are unhappy. The monarchy in Spain was the Bourbon monarchy, which was related to the former French monarchy under Louis XVI. And so a lot of these local leaders, like these Creole leaders, will set up what are called juntas, which are like little governments basically in exile, and they will sort of pledge their allegiance to the Bourbon monarchy instead of this new Bonapartist monarchy instead. So those are two big factors here that are going to lead to some of this that's going to take place. Okay, let's talk about the Haitian Revolution because it occurs first, but also just because it works, it's kind of works a little bit better here. Again, it is debatable as to whether this fits solidly or well within Latin America because again, they don't speak Spanish. They're on an island that's pretty far away from a lot of Spanish-speaking areas. They are French, originally as a colony, but technically it could. So let's just do it here. So the Haitian Revolution, again, this is a nice, simple impression here of it. It is primarily a slave revolution. There are Creoles who try to rise up against the French. The slaves see this as an opportunity to rise up and try to overthrow both of them, and so they do so. And so there's going to end up being a long-term conflict here after this. Again, these Creoles, these groups of people, the slaves and others, had read some Enlightenment ideas. They realize that these are good ideas, and so they want to be independent and they want to be free as well. But the French do not want to give it up because Saint-Domingue, which is the name of the island at the time, or the little colony at the time, was incredibly lucrative. They made a lot of money off of it. So they will end up fighting a long conflict and an attempt to retain control of the Haitian mainland. Ultimately, it will be unsuccessful, partly due to Haitian resistance, but also, again, due to those aforementioned diseases. While Europeans have immunity to a lot of diseases like smallpox, like we talked about, a lot of things like malaria, you can't really get immunity to it exactly, and so it is in bad situations in places like Haiti where there's a lot of mosquitoes and stuff. So that will end up causing a lot of problems. Don't forget Toussaint Louverture is our main guy who's going to be the main leader of this revolt, though there's also Jean-Jacques Dessalines and a couple of others. At the end of this fight then, after all these years, they will get independence, but it causes a lot of problems for Haiti because nobody wants to be associated with a country that is a product of a slave revolt. If they have slaves, right? Americans are terrified of Haiti. They don't recognize it. Lots of these other countries that still have slavery do the same thing. And so Haiti is left to sort of like exist on its own, sort of outside of the whole system of empire that we have in other places. Okay? That's a real basic example of the Haitian Revolution. Anybody got any questions about that to follow up? Again, it mostly fits within these Creole revolutions because it's kind of the first one that gets inspired. It also has a direct connection to Simón de Bolivar. Okay, so Simón de Bolivar actually gets some assistance from the Haitian revolutionaries. So they have their own country, and at one point, Bolivar goes away, runs away. He goes to Jamaica for a while and writes this thing called the Jamaica Letter, where he lays out his ideas and these sort of like Enlightenment concepts. But he also gets some assistance from the leaders of the Haitian government also to try to get this kind of resistance. So it fits okay here. Let's go to the South American ones then. These are often known as the Creole revolutions, though debatably Mexico could be a part of that as well. Bolivar is going to be in the north part of South America. He will end up forming a country called Gran Colombia that will collapse kind of after him, but it will end up forming the modern-day countries of Venezuela and Colombia, Ecuador. Also in the south, we will have José de San Martin in Argentina and that sort of area where they will also lead a resistance. These two guys will sort of meet in the middle in Peru, and that will free all of the Spanish-speaking parts of South America. However, right after this, though, and kind of in the same time period, we will have the rise of these groups of people called caudillos. Caudillo. This kind of is like a strong man, strong person kind of person. Right? So basically what this means is that these are dictators, but they're kind of dictators that are centered less around like weird control of the state and more around just their personal magnetism and personal military strength. So some of these guys would be classic examples of that. I mean, Bolivar is sort of this as well. But these guys basically are, while they sort of have the notion of independence or freedom, they don't really practice it very much at all. So the caudillos. These revolts were inspired by the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, as we said before. They have these Enlightenment ideals and hatred of Napoleon, which will lead to these revolutions that are taking place down here. Again, nice overview of those revolutions. Anybody have any questions here about those? Rocking and rolling. All right. Let's talk about Mexico. So there's a Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. That was actually, again, the DBQ on Monday. But before we ever get to there, we have to start off with the Mexican War of Independence. I'd originally called this the Mexican Revolution, the first Mexican Revolution, I think. And some people use that term on occasion. But this apparently is the more preferred term in history. This goes from about 1808 to 1821. It is not a consistent and solid conflict the entire time. And in fact, sometimes historians will end it in 1817 with the New Mexican Constitution. It just depends on who you're talking to or whatever. But it kind of has two phases: the initial phase in 1808, and then the later phase in 1821 when they get formal independence. So this whole thing is going to start off in about 1810 or so with something known as the Cry of Dolores. Dolores is a city, and this guy, Father Hidalgo y Castillo, will rise up with his peasant group. He is basically like a priest who's in the countryside, and he has this peasant flock. He has this flock of low caste kind of people, and he wants them to be independent. And so he raises up this idea of independence. And I think he thinks probably that the elites, the Creole elites and others may kind of join him in this. But what happens then is that the Creole elites, who are already upset, in Mexico with Spain, they are also forming these juntas, and they don't want to deal with the Bonapartists. They are also though terrified of peasant revolts, right? They're like, oh wow, yeah, we would like independence, but y'all are just not quite at Creole enough, So they will resist against this group. And so what we'll see then is that the Cry of Dolores under Father Hidalgo, that initial phase is going to be put down by the government, in particular by this guy named Augustin de Iturbide. We'll talk about more in a second. So they will put down that initial phase, but they start moving towards this. The Creole elites start seeing this as a way to do something, or maybe we should go ahead and start kind of pushing for this. So they have these juntas and others that are there as well. What eventually happens then is they issue a new constitution in 1917, and then this guy, Augustin de Iturbide, is going to end up leading a revolt against the Spanish in a more formal way. They will end up, there's not really a lot of military conflict necessarily, and there is some, but not a ton. But he will eventually, in 1821, they will declare independence, and they will get the Spanish essentially to agree to it. It's kind of the Spanish are kind of yeah, maybe kind of thing. But that's considered to be the time that they get their independence, is in 1821. So the thing about it is we're going to see an initial sort of wave of lower class revolution that's going to take place. The Creoles are going to side with the Peninsulares in this because they're more terrified of the low-level people. But then once they get a chance and they realize they can do that, they sort of make a deal with those people and they revolt against the Peninsulares instead and take control of this area on their own. Now, hilariously, Iturbide then will declare himself emperor, which is hilarious, the emperor of Mexico. 2 years, he's then exiled, he comes back and they execute him. He lasts 2 years as the emperor, which is hilarious. Then they will have a period of military rule under this guy Santa Anna, who you may know from Remember the Alamo guy, right? This is when Texan independence will take place, is under Santa Anna. And we'll have a few of these sort of military figures as they kind of waffle back and forth between sort of liberalism and conservatism. 19th century liberalism and conservatism. Eventually, then, we will have this guy named Porfirio Diaz who will take over. He is sort of a liberal reformer, and under his rule, things get pretty good, actually. Over the time period that he is in charge, which is sort of the middle of the 19th century until he's in charge until 1910, but sort of in a weird way. So he's there for quite a while. He does really, really good job. They start improving Mexico in enormous ways. But they have an election, and he loses, and he decides, you know what? I'm not happy about that. So with some other friends of his, they basically reinstall him as the leader. They basically overthrow the democratic election, and he is put in charge again. However, that is very unpopular, and so from this point on, then, a lot of the good things that he did start to get kind of disrupted. This is also the time when he starts bringing in a lot of foreign investments, so a lot of Americans are going to come in and invest money into Mexico. So a lot of the poverty, the poor people, the lower class people are not getting any sort of support or anything from the government, and that causes a huge problem as well. And so that is the state then around 1900 when we move into the last of these four time periods, which is that Porfirio Diaz is on the throne, almost literally. He's not a king, but he's the president, and things are kind of going south in a lot of ways. People are unhappy with his government from what's going on. Excuse me, any questions? We good on time period 3? Awesome. All right, lastly, let's take a look at the modern time period here. I should mention one other thing. I don't have it up here. Again, it does fit within this time period, but Brazil, don't forget, also gets its independence in this period. It does so in kind of a weird way, which is that the Portuguese royal family just sort of moves there, and then when they leave their son, and he just declares it independent, which is hilarious. So Pedro I becomes the new emperor of Brazil, and he's the emperor for a while until they kick him out. So, moving over to the last phase here, let's just continue our story of the Mexican Revolution. We'll talk a bit about U.S. imperialism and some other stuff going on down there in Latin America and South America. So in Mexico, then 1910, we will have the Mexican Revolution. This is against Porfirio Diaz. Basically, Diaz kind of hints that he is going to retire, but then he kind of is like, fake, I'm not going to retire. And so this guy Madero was the guy who was supposed to basically win the election, or at least he did really well in this election. And so when Diaz just basically sets himself up again as the president, Madero gets unhappy. They kick Diaz out, and basically we end up having a little period here where there's some turmoil going on. So they will overthrow Porfirio Diaz. There's some turmoil with Madero, as well as this guy named Zapata, Emilio Zapata, who was like a kind of peasant leader. And so these guys, this collection of different people, then will end up forming a party called the PRI, the Party of Institutional Revolution. This is a political party that will be under these groups in an attempt to sort of like lead Mexico into a new way. This party is actually in charge of Mexico from when they were put in place, which maybe it was like 1920 or 18 or something, until about 2000. Like they were the only party that really had any control in Mexico whatsoever. Okay, one thing that we will see here, and we'll see it more in Mexico maybe than in some other places, we'll see it in Central America as well though, is when we talk about the last like Unit 9 kind of stuff, we talked a bit about like liberalism, like the liberalizing of economies, or neoliberalism, and outsourcing of goods. This is something that's going to take place in Mexico as well as Central America in particular. You will see some of it in Latin America, it's South America, but it's going to be more here. So like for example, once NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement comes in, a lot of like cars are moved just across the Rio Grande River, and so they're built there. Like small cars where you don't make a lot of money on them, they start shifting them there. So like the Chevy Cruze, which I don't think they make anymore, but like the Chevy Cruze and stuff was built over in Mexico because it was cheaper and they could actually make a profit on it, as opposed to making like gigantic GMC trucks where they make a ton of money. So that's kind of where that's coming from. You're also going to see a lot of that kind of stuff going into Central America for things like clothes. So the other day when we were looking at our clothes to see where they were made, a lot of them were made in Southeast Asia areas, but also a number of them were made in places like Honduras or Nicaragua or areas like that. Like those are also places where a lot of these kind of things are being shipped out to. That also, again, is true in South America as well, but a little bit less so. One last thing here then, for kind of like, this is South America, but it's kind of everything too, which is U.S. imperialism in space, right? So this is going to be a little more connected to this period as well, but it kind of bleeds over here also. Don't forget that the United States has a lot of control over Puerto Rico, for example, still today. They also are going to set up these banana republics, which are these like kind of states basically where the government, where the United States feels free to intervene and do whatever the companies say. So it's named after that because of the banana companies and stuff that were set up to control those areas. But those are all examples in the United States sort of operating in this region. Also, just a little bit here, we do see some fascism in sort of the pre-World War II and World War II periods. So Brazil will have this guy named Getulio Vargas. And in Argentina, we have Juan Perón. If anybody's ever seen Evita, it is about his wife, Eva Perón. But these two then are going to be sort of pseudo-fascists. Largely Latin America will sit out World War II and really World War I. Like they are involved. They're like allies of the U.S. And so we like definitely do some things. Mexico, for example, we have a program called the Bracero program where we ask a lot of Mexicans to come over to America to replace some of our soldiers that are going to war in like the factories and stuff. That gets a little controversial, but it's generally pretty well accepted. But we're going to have a lot of that kind of stuff, but they're not really fighting or like going and being involved in that kind of stuff. Again, modern day then, we have these sort of outsourcing and liberalism policies that are going on with our economies today. Okay, does that help out a little bit with sort of the basic pattern and format? Who's got some questions about anything here? Again, it is a nightmare of Mr. Osborne's handwriting. You will, if you look at it properly and read it, I think you can summon demons. I don't know, it's that bad, So, what you got? What questions? Yeah.
So how does like Enlightenment, like 19th century liberalism, differ from like neoliberalism?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So she's asking a question here about neoliberalism versus, or like modern day liberalism in the economy versus sort of that liberalism conservatism in the 19th century. So in general, then, like remember we talked a bit about conservatives and liberals when we talked about like ideologies in Europe, right? So conservatives, by and large, were just people who are interested in keeping things the old way. Okay, so in that context, then keeping things the old way in the 19th century typically, or sometimes, could mean things like even not quite mercantilist policies because they got rid of those, but like very conservative types of like economic policies, right? So while they're going to be capitalistic, they're going to be very conservative with that capitalistic kind of ideas. The liberalism then is going to be about like having more freedom, more individual-like kind of ideas. So like these are the folks who are going to really embrace that wealth of nations, sort of let everybody kind of do what they want to when it comes to the economy, right? So fast forward then, today liberalism has more to do with like political philosophies, but one of the core ideas of liberalism though is the idea that people should have sort of individual freedoms, and so that sort of ties in with this idea also. Modern day economic liberalism then is all about like companies and people should be willing and free to make whatever economic choices they want. So like if I want to buy everything off Amazon because it's cheap, I should be able to do that. And if Amazon is able to provide that and do well for it, great, that's fine. Let them do that, right? So this whole policy here then is all about shipping things overseas, right, to other countries or other countries to make those things because it's cheaper, and that's a choice that they should be able to make within the market. So it's not 100% like, for example, liberals probably from that time period probably wouldn't agree with the modern version of liberal economics. Like they'd be like, well, it's a little too much for us maybe. Like we still should be a little more careful about like what things are going on. But that's sort of the inevitable consequence of that idea that if we're going to have very free markets, then inevitably that free market is going to lead to these things that are going on, such as this these kind of policies towards other countries. Does that kind of explain it? You're getting this kind of in the weeds a little bit here on that because it's like there's a lot more detail that's involved in that, but that's probably the best way that I can describe it. It's interesting because again, modern politics, you know, we think of though, I mean, the Democrats and Republicans are pretty much on the same with this in a lot of ways. We tend to think of the Republican Party as being the one of more, or the conservatives as being less government regulation-y, you know, and so that kind of is confusing. But we also do have kind of this great shift in American politics that takes place in the 1960s and 70s. That is a whole other can of beans. You'll learn about that in 2 years. So, okay, other questions? Everybody good? All right, cool. Well, thanks for coming. Thank you out there as well. Did you spot the secret on the board? No, I'm just kidding. There's no secret on the board. All right, thanks anyway. We'll be doing another one of these very soon, probably next week. But take care. Thanks for listening.